Okay, so the reason I actually like the hip thrust is not that it's just this incredibly novel exercise. We do a hip extension in a lot of ways. I think it's great because it doesn't axially load the spine. I've had a few bodybuilders who get a and powerlifters too, but bodybuilders I think is a little more interesting, who have had a lumbar injury and they can't effectively squat, they can't effectively deadlift, and we can get by through isolation at the knee joint and hip thrusts, and you would never know they didn't squat or deadlift. Because they're still getting all the joint movements, they're still finding a way to overload. It's a really useful way to work around injury. Now, with that said, the hip thrust also has some other cool elements, which we don't have a whole lot of data on whether it actually produces differential hypertrophy or has some kind of difference when it comes to bodybuilding outcomes. But for those who care about sport performance, there's an interesting effect that vertical force production doesn't always transfer to horizontal force production and vice versa. So for example, doing plyometrics probably wouldn't be as effective as increasing your sprint times, or decreasing your sprint times rather, versus doing like heavy sled running. Okay? Which makes sense, it's just specificity, directional movements. So there is some research that was part of Brett's thesis showing that the hip thrust might be better than a squat for specifically horizontal force production, it's just specificity, it doesn't surprise me. Now, for a bodybuilder though, what is kind of interesting is that if you think about when you are in complete contraction of the glutes in a squat, the load is not hard, right? When you walk out a squat, you guys can think of this. This isn't difficult to hold there besides the fact that you've got a lot of weight on your shoulders, right? It's not a challenge to the glutes. However, in a hip thrust, the hardest part when you're maximally contracted is at the top. So there's a different force curve. So it might be a useful novel stimulus. It might have some beneficial effect. Same thing with like a 45-degree hyperextension. The glutes are having to work harder as they move through the contraction. So you can make an argument that from a biomechanical perspective, it might be a greater challenge to the glutes. Okay? So I think it's a useful enough exercise to include, especially for a physique athlete, obviously. Other things that would be good if you're really worried about kind of glute training would be some type of frontal plane movement, like abduction of some type. Many ways to do that. But then really the biggest bang for your buck for your glutes is going to be our primary hip extension exercises, squats, deadlifts. If you're a physique competitor though, you don't want to leave anything to chance. You want to do some type of abduction and perhaps think about a horizontal hip extension that doesn't load your spine and also is really good when you're injured. Okay? Not a requirement, and you've certainly seen plenty of people with great glutes who don't do this. So I'm not necessarily on board with the thrust as a must, but I think the thrust is a nice thing to do in addition to what you're already doing. Trust the thrust, and it'll probably give you a bigger butt. They won't do that, though. All right. Okay, so how the hell do you do it? Now, they're the two primary ways you've seen this done is where you do it actually on the floor, which is actually a glute bridge. The glute bridge doesn't give as much of a range of motion, and you start like traveling backwards along the ground. I like the hip thrust because you get a little more range of motion. It's a pain in the ass to set up. As you will see when I try to do this and I go, maybe this isn't a proper setup, maybe this platform is in the way, we'll see. But essentially what you want to do is get it into your hip crease, get yourself up onto the bench so that the pad's just below your scapula so you can hinge on it, and I'll show you some technique things. Now, as soon as you get even reasonably strong on this will become incredibly uncomfortable. Some good things to have, like, and a squat pad probably won't be enough, especially if you're lean or have bony hips. Airex pads. You guys ever heard of Airex pads? Airex pads? Airex? It's a pun. A-I-R-E-X. They're those back in like the early 2000s when NASM was really huge, like the Gotta Train Balance. They're just one of those ways. Those are actually useless for normal training, but great for padding a bar against your hip. Airex pads are great. They're kind of expensive for some reason. Those are very useful. A folded up yoga mat, but then you kind of have like this yoga mat shit in your face. Some of the big squat bars, those are nice, but then the surface area on your hip is larger. So far, the best thing I've found is an Airex pad, and you can cut them up into small pieces. So anyway, sir?
Foam roller is a bucket, so we use.
Oh, you put the bar through the foam roller. Well, that's a creative solution. I'm impressed. That too. Okay, so you want to get the bar so that you have travel distance, okay? Because you're going to have to then actually tuck your feet back underneath you. Then you're going to want to use your elbows to anchor, getting the height of the pad basically underneath your scapula, okay? if your height is different than mine, you wouldn't be able to use this setup. You can do things like elevate the plates on plates, or elevate this on plates, figure out a way to find the right setup. It's kind of a pain in the ass. All right, then once you get into position, scapula is just above the pad, stabilize. And now here's where you're going to do some things that are going to go counterintuitive to the way you've learned how to do compound movements. If I was to think of this like a squatter and a deadlifter, I would keep this segment completely rigid and just go from here to here. And that's fine. And you may feel your glutes pretty well when you do that. However, the glutes, as I was talking about earlier, also posteriorly tilt the hip. And when you are in thoracic flexion, they tend to do more work because they're taking over from the lumbar extensors. Okay? So there's a few ways, because it's a compound movement when you really want to drill down to it. We're trying to isolate the glutes and the hamstrings though. So you want to actually be in slight thoracic flexion. Think of keeping your abs tight. And then at the top of the movement, when you get here, don't hyperextend the spine, but think of posteriorly tilting. So it should kind of look like, you ever seen like a cat have sex? Like, you know, you kind of, right at the top, you need to kind of be right there. So you're flexed down here, tilting your hips under. Notice that I'm not doing this. You'll see a lot of people do this, go into hyperextension. And that's actually going to get a lot more lumbar than it is glutes. So it's tilt under, flex down, and that's your range of motion. Okay? Right there. Now, depending on the person, you may feel a lot of different things in different areas than your glutes. If you feel your glutes, fantastic, carry on, load it up, go to town. If you feel a lot of hamstring, you want to try different foot positions. You may want to try abducting a little bit, thinking of pushing your knees out at the top. Even putting a band around your knees is actually really helpful, because that actually forces you to be in a constant abduction, which stresses the glutes. Yeah, and basically foot position changes, external rotation of the foot changes, pushing your knees out changes, potentially using a band are all the ways that you can work on trying to feel it. The band is also a useful way just to teach it. And once you really tend to feel the glutes, you can get rid of it. Sometimes you go back to it. So I'm really tired for some reason. I did like 3 reps. Oh man.